We're continuing in our survey of the Old Testament, and today we're going to talk about the Nevi'im, or the prophets. So let's continue on from Joshua chapter 1 verse 1. We see that after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, the Lord said to Joshua son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses my servant is dead. Now then you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites, and finally ready to take the promised land. But this is not the first generation that left Egypt. In fact, it's the second generation. Now look what happens in Judges chapter 2. In verse 10, the Bible reads, After that the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Now this is the third generation. So the first generation leave Egypt, they die off in the wilderness. The second generation takes the promised land, at least parts of the promised land. And then in Judges we meet the third generation, and tragically they neither knew God nor what he had done, which again continues the story of humanity rejecting God. Now if you read Judges, you'll find things go from bad to worse very quickly. Now in 1 Samuel 8, we find in verse 4, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. But when they said, Give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. So we find this pattern that started in Genesis and still continues, where God's people are rejecting God as king, instead wanting to be kings themselves. So Saul becomes the first king of Israel, and then you have David and Solomon. Now let's check out 1 Kings chapter 6. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the second month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. Now when we go back to Genesis chapter 2 verse 1 to 3, we find God resting, in other words coming and dwelling with his creation. Creation rejects him. And then we find in Exodus 40 God tabernacling with his people, in effect a mobile temple. And then here we find finally God is dwelling with his people in a temple that is built by Solomon. And after Solomon's death, now Rehoboam is Solomon's son. In verse 13, the king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. And this foolish decision has devastating consequences, and the kingdom splits into the northern and the southern. The north is called Israel, and the south is called Judah. If you go to Deuteronomy 28 verse 36, this is the covenant consequence of disobedience, and this is where the prophets come into play. Check out, for example, Isaiah 7 verse 17. Isaiah the prophet says, The Lord will bring on you and your people and on the house of your father time unlike any since Ephraim is another name for Israel, broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. So that's the role of the covenant prophets. They would call God's people to covenant faithfulness. And then they're warned when they fail to keep the covenant. But also the prophets had messages of hope, of covenant restoration. So here's some reflections from the session. What did you learn from the session? What convictions are being formed inside you from what you've learned in this session? And here's a third question that might take a bit of time to reflect and pray and to discuss amongst yourself. In what ways can we be covenant prophets in our small groups?